Hello, everyone, and welcome to our June 10th, 2025 call for the CARC Combined Staff and Student Workforce Development Interest Groups. Today, we are joined by Henry Neeman from the University of Oklahoma. Henry will be talking to us about several CI professional training workshops that he organizes, which are great opportunities for facilitators, for people interested in becoming leaders, and more. And we'll get to hear about all of them from Henry today. This is being recorded. As you heard earlier, Henry is very interested in hearing your questions, so please share them. And if you have not yet done so, please sign in the call document. And Henry, please take it away.
All right, let me do a screen share here. There we go. Okay, I'm going to pop up the chat window and I'm going to reiterate what both Tim and Michael said, which is yes, please constantly interrupt me. That's more fun for me than listening to myself droning on and on. So don't be shy. You are welcome to interrupt me by voice or by Zoom chat. Either way is fine. I've got the Zoom chat up on my desktop, so hopefully this will all work beautifully. And yes, I have 72 slides. I don't expect to get through all of them. And finally, despite what the video image looks like, I am not constructed entirely out of neck fat. So we're going to give this a go. So quick outline, we'll talk about the CI professional ecosystem and why enterprise training isn't a solution for us. I'll walk you through the 5 levels of CI professional training that we'll be talking about today. Then we'll start with the virtual residency program. That's a couple of levels. Then the newly sort of decoupled becoming an institutional CI leader workshop. And then the CI Leadership Academy, which is also a couple of levels. And then time permitting, we'll talk about the Certified Cyberinfrastructure Facilitator Training and Development Program, but I don't know whether there will be time to get to that. And if there is, there probably won't be time to get through all of it. So the future belongs to those who show up. I don't know who originally said that, but I think it's a really important point. And our job here is to show up. So let's talk about the CI professional ecosystem. So what I've got here is by no means a complete list. It's a fraction of all of the different groups in the CI professional ecosystem. They are all working sometimes jointly, sometimes individually to advance the cyber infrastructure professions. And some of these have been going for a decade or longer. Some of them more like 2 decades or getting on to. Some of them are relatively new. All of them are addressing different facets of the CI professional ecosystem, including different facings. I'm guessing as members of CARC, many of you already have exposure to the facings. But they're all very, very important components in the overall development, excuse me, of the cyber infrastructure professions. All right. The easiest thing in the world to do would be to point at an existing training provided by our enterprise colleagues and say, just go take those trainings and you will be all set. Unfortunately, that doesn't seem to work very well. And the issue is one of scale. So there are millions of enterprise IT professionals. Just in the United States, there are millions. Worldwide, I'm guessing tens of millions. The compound annual growth rate for the IT professions. Now, I believe this is in the US. It's probably similar worldwide, but I'm not sure I have data for worldwide. The compound annual growth rate is a little bit over 5%. So this workforce, the IT workforce in general, the enterprise IT workforce, is doubling about every 13 years. So it's a huge group of people, and therefore it is worth it for academic institutions to create degree programs. It is worth it for third parties to create professional certifications. There's an enormous amount of resources constantly being devoted to updating people's enterprise IT skills. And this doesn't even take into account data science, which is a completely separate thing that kind of blew up in the late 2010s. And so for the past 15 or 20 years, this has been growing very rapidly. Data science, there are now data science degree programs in every state except Alaska and Wyoming. And admittedly, the last time I looked at this was quite some months ago. So it might be that Alaska and or Wyoming has this now as well. Many of you live in states that have multiple or even many degree and certificate programs in data science. By contrast, research computing is merely thousands of professionals. So there's no degree programs, there's no certifications, there's minimal resources for updating skills. And so our best bet is to use informal education in order to provide the training people need, or at least a corner of the training people need, while being able to do it at a scale that is appropriate for the size of the community. So one of the difficulties is if the entire community is a few thousand people, then a university is not going to start a degree program in this because they're not going to get enough people into that degree program year by year to justify continuing the program. So in today's discussion, we're going to look at 5 different levels of CI professional training. And let's break it down. So the virtual residency, which is focused specifically on CI facilitators, has 2 levels. Sort of has 3, but now we're breaking that 3rd level out. I'll talk about that in a minute. So the introductory level is foundational skills for new CI facilitators, pre-service and early in-service CI facilitators. Now, not that those aren't useful for more experienced CI facilitators as well, and we've gotten a lot of uptake across those levels, but it's designed for the benefit of early career CI facilitators. The intermediate level of the virtual residency is designed to add more CI facilitation skills, not the lowest foundational level skills, but increasingly higher levels of sophistication in terms of facilitation skills. And so it's targeted at more experienced CI facilitators, where here more experience doesn't mean like 10 years, it means like a year or 2 or more. So then beyond that intermediate level is when we start transitioning people from facilitators to institutional CI leaders. And so we used to incorporate this into some of the virtual residency workshops. We called it the advanced level. Now we've broken it out into a workshop of its own because the demand for this capability has grown quite substantially. So the becoming an institutional CI leader, and honestly, I'd like to come up with a better name than that, but that's the name we have right now. It's designed for all kinds of CI professionals, not just facilitators, who are interested in making that leap, transitioning from CI professional, whether it's CI sysadmin, a facilitator, a research data librarian, a system administrator, or a research network engineer, any of those positions, any of the facings now want to move into a position of leadership at their institution with respect to CI, with respect to research computing and data. And then at the sort of high end of that pipeline is the CI Leadership Academy. And this is for established CI leaders, not people transitioning into leadership, but people who already are CI leaders. And here it's, we've ended up with 2 levels. We originally had 1, which was transitioning from institutional CI leadership to national CI leadership. That was the original goal of the CI Leadership Academy. But the feedback that we got from the institutional CI leaders was, yeah, we want to also have an opportunity to improve our institutional CI leadership skills. So in a way, you can think of the Becoming an Institutional CI Leader workshop as focused on novice CI leaders, the Improving Institutional CI Leadership Skills level, intermediate CI leaders, and the transition to national leadership for advanced CI leaders. Okay, so let's talk about the virtual residency program. And again, feel free to interrupt me anytime. I love questions. So what is the virtual residency? We teach the pre-service and in-service CI facilitators how to do research computing or CI facilitation, or how to do it better. It's really both of those things. And then we also have a hidden secret agenda, which I will get to. So how do we do that? What's the mechanism? Well, the biggest part of it is we do an annual week-long summer workshop, and we've been doing these since 2015. So the one that's coming up in a few weeks is I believe, the 11th annual summer workshop in the virtual residency program. There was the University of California system actually ran its own workshops based on our workshop a couple of times in 2017 and 18, and I contributed a little bit to those workshops. Then there's virtual residency workshop planning calls. The community develops the workshop. It's not a top-down organization. It's a grassroots-driven organization. We have an annual meeting at the SC Supercomputing Conference where we just get together for an hour and talk and hang out and learn from each other. And then we've run some apprenticeships. So we ran a grant proposal writing apprenticeship where we wrote a grant proposal together. We stopped running it. We put it on hiatus because we got the grant. Then we did a paper writing apprenticeship. We did that for several years and got a number of papers published as a result of that. And we'll pick that up again, but we've been on pause because we haven't really had a good paper to write recently. And then there's a grant running apprenticeship that's ongoing now as we're running the grant that we got from as the result of the grant proposal writing apprenticeship. An important point about this is before we created the virtual residency, no one had ever been dumb enough to try and teach this stuff. Now, I'd had this as a gleam in my eye for a very long time that I wanted to teach people essentially how to do my job. But we didn't really have a mechanism to execute on that. And then it sort of all came together, and it's been going great ever since. In fact, the grant that paid for this was 10% of an NSF campus cyberinfrastructure grant. And it is by far the most impactful part of that grant. The other stuff was good and useful, and I'm glad we did it. But this is the thing that has really had the big return on investment. All right, why do we do the virtual residency? Well, CI facilitators typically have strong experience within their own discipline, which more often than not is not computer science. But most facilitators, and in fact, most CI pros in general, haven't been faculty. So they don't necessarily know how to work effectively with faculty. Some of them have had little or no research experience. This is especially true for enterprise IT staff who suddenly become research computing professionals. A very common mechanism, especially at non-R1 institutions, is the CIO goes, okay, Janet, now you're in charge of research computing. And Janet says, hamana, 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 and then we hope that we can alert Janet about the annual workshop and she can learn how to be a CI facilitator, because as an enterprise IT professional, she probably had very little exposure to that. Even if they do have a strong research background, they typically don't have experience with research outside their own discipline, right? If I'm an astronomer, I probably have very little exposure to research in life sciences. I probably have very little exposure to research in digital humanities. Anything outside, heck, I probably have very little exposure to high energy physics. So there's a transition where you have to move from being a specialist to being a generalist. And that is the opposite direction of what we teach people who pursue PhDs. When you pursue a PhD, by the time you finish your dissertation, by the time you defend, you are the world's foremost expert on some tiny little corner of knowledge. That is very different from having a very little expertise on a whole lot of different areas. You know, the joke of a specialist knows more and more about less and less until eventually they know everything about nothing, whereas a generalist knows less and less about more and more until eventually they know nothing about everything. That's the tension that we're looking at. When we started doing the virtual residency back in 2015, there weren't any programs at all to teach people how to be a facilitator. Not locally, not regionally, not nationally. There was no such thing. And the reason this matters is, you know, when I started, I started doing this job, you could argue I started doing this job in the mid 80s. although it didn't have that name back then. And really, I was labeled as a research programmer, and I was an undergrad research programmer. But I was sort of starting to do these sorts of things even back then. And when I got into the job I have now, and this is already almost 25 years ago, nobody knew what to expect from me. So I had time to figure out what the job was and how to do it. Those days are over. Now, if you get hired as a CI facilitator, you're expected to be productive the first day. How are you going to do that? Because it's not like this is a common thing that's easy to find out how to do, right? All right, well, why is it hard to help researchers? That seems like it ought to be easy, right? Well, here's the difficulty. Research computing is becoming more and more common in two different dimensions. One is it's applicable to more and more disciplines, more and more subdisciplines, more and more subdisciplines, right? They're doing more data intensive and computing intensive research than ever before. And this is accelerating, doubly so because of the rise of AI, machine learning, deep learning, all that kind of stuff, which is to a significant extent, although by no means entirely, but to a significant extent, dependent on research computing and in particular high performance computing. But it's also ubiquitous within any given discipline. The demand for these capabilities is constantly growing. A higher and higher fraction of researchers within each subdiscipline is consuming research computing techniques, technologies, and services. The machines are getting more complex all the time. And in particular, the storage hierarchy keeps getting deeper and deeper, and parallelism keeps getting more and more hybrid. And this means using the machines is harder and harder, which means that unless you only want gurus, experts to know even how to run a job, you're going to have someone help bridge that gap. And finally, there's the conceptual distance. This is what most researchers think computing is. This is what most human beings think computing is. That is a very long way away from command line, Linux, batch, remote, shared, which is what research computing typically is. And so you have to get people over the gap. And the problem is, although all of this gets truer and truer over time, researchers' tolerance for how long it takes to get productive has not changed by even a microsecond. 1 hour. If you can't get them productive in 1 hour, they give up. All right, so who's been involved in the virtual residency? We've served over 1,700 people from over 500 institutions in every US state and 4 US territories, plus 19 other countries on every continent except Antarctica. And honestly, I despair of Antarctica. There just aren't enough people there to make this work. Excuse me, I'd love to serve Antarctica and say all 7 continents, but here we are, including a huge fraction of minority serving institutions, a substantial number, not a huge fraction, but a substantial number of non-PhD granting institutions, a big fraction of institutions in EPSCoR jurisdictions, that is, states and territories that get less than 0.75% of federal research funding dollars, and over 300 institutions among the campus champion institutions. And this is for all of the virtual residency activities. Now, more and more institutions have on-campus cyber infrastructure. So right now, 89% of R1s have on-campus research computing capability, and over a third of R2s do. So it's a huge thing at research-intensive institutions to have on-campus. By contrast, there are only 3 R1s that I've been able to discover that have their primary or sole approach to research computing machinery is commercial cloud. So Emory, I think it's George Washington. I can't remember if it's George Washington or George Mason or Georgetown, but it's one of the Georges in the greater DC metro area, and University of Maryland, Baltimore. Those 3, as far as I know, are the only 3 where that's the case. So everybody else is using on-campus machines. And there's a very straightforward reason for that. It's much more expensive to run in commercial cloud than it is to run locally. much more expensive. For general computing, it's about a factor of 2. For GPU computing, depending on the vendor, it's somewhere between a factor of 5 and a factor of 22. And I looked at the top majors to figure that out. It may be different at specific individual other vendors, but the big ones, those are the multipliers compared to doing it on premise, on campus. Huge fractions. Now, so most institutions actually have already participated in the virtual residency, including 89% of the R1s and more than half of the R2s. We did an evaluation 5 years ago of the virtual residency workshop that year, so 2020. What we found was we did a really good job, and we did a really good job for everyone. So we compared women versus men. We compared underrepresented minorities versus non-minorities. And what we found was the participation rate for those groups was much higher, lower than the US as a country, but much higher than all computing and IT occupations. And more important, well, somewhat higher than all computing occupations, but much higher than research computing in general. And we use the SC conference as the baseline for that. So about 13-14% of attendees at SC 15 to 17, which is the ones they've published the data for, were women, compared to, we had more than double that. For underrepresented minorities, we don't have data from the SC conferences, so I can't talk to that, but for all computing and IT occupations, the virtual residency has double the representation. So probably based on what we see for research computing versus all of computing, probably 4 times, if I were guessing, 4 times the rate for research computing as a whole. Does it work? Well, what we found was the lowest scored session was a 3.9 out of 5. So B minus was the worst we got, right? And the highest we got was a 4.4, so that's a solid A, right? How about, did it do better or worse for various groups? Well, for underrepresented minorities, the answer was they actually got slightly more out of it than the non-minorities. So they were 5% more successful in terms of their experience. They were got 12% higher on a couple of the sessions, the ones that they had a statistically significant difference on. They liked the Google Docs better, but there were no other statistically significant differences found. With women, there was one session that women rated 10% lower than men, and that was statistically significant. Otherwise, no other statistically significant differences. So everybody got a lot of value out of it. The other measure is, do people come back? Because everybody's busy, and if it sucked, you wouldn't bother to come back. So we measured that, and it turns out y'all come back in pretty big numbers. Okay, so the workshop that we have coming up, it's in a couple of weeks, so the week of June 23rd to 27th. All the sessions are an hour and a quarter. That's been the case since the beginning. We're doing 4 sessions each day, except the final day, the Friday of that week. We're just doing the morning, so people have the afternoon off, because nobody likes doing stuff on Friday afternoons. And we recognize everybody's going to go off and drink beer or whatever. It's only on Zoom. We used to do a hybrid in-person and video conferencing, but it turned out to be a lot of trouble and expense, and Zoom has worked very effectively, so we thought we'll just go with Zoom only. That'll reduce the trouble, the expense, the labor cost, and more people be able to participate as panelists, moderators, speakers, and so on. It's targeted at cyber infrastructure facilitators, and it's a mix of introductory and intermediate. What sessions we do each workshop are determined by polling the virtual residency participants over the years, the people who are on the mailing list. That's been very successful. We get good uptake on the poll. And that gives us a statistically representative sample typically. I mean, it's self-selected, but still. So, and all of the speakers and presenters, all the panel moderators and panelists, they're all volunteers. So we have 8 talk presenters, we have 9 panel moderators, and 50 panelists. Several years ago, we got some complaints from attendees saying, we don't want to hear from the same people over and over in multiple different sessions. So please don't reuse the same speakers, the same presenters during the same workshop. Like year to year, that's fine, but within a workshop, all unique or as much as possible. So that's exactly what we're doing. So here's the breakdown of the sessions we're going to do. We'll start with an overview of the virtual residency, the workshop, the program. Effective communication. This is how to talk to researchers, because how you talk to people in different disciplines is different from how you talk to people in your own discipline. Then we'll do CI user support and the CI landscape. Then we'll get into some, and you can see there's a mix of intermediate and introductory, facilitating AI, machine learning, deep learning, intake interview. So an intake interview is where you talk to someone who you've never worked with before to figure out what are they working on, what do they need, how can you help them? So we'll have sort of a lecture demonstration on intake interviews. Then we're going to have a panel on how to learn and how to teach research computing resources, and a talk on research networking. Then we've got reducing barriers to entry for new users, how to make it easier for them to get going. And then we have an intake interview practicum where you're going to put into practice and can earn a badge on intake interviews, a practicum where we will actually do intake interviews with real researchers. And I've got 9 or 10 of them lined up so far. I'm trying to get several more so we have enough to go round and have a pretty good group. And I've already got judges lined up who will be judging the participants to give them the badge. And then we'll talk about how to communicate that there's a problem that needs to be addressed. And then we'll work on research data management. We've got explaining complex technical topics to researchers, building lasting collaborations with researchers, facilitating cloud and explaining the pros and cons, assessing and anticipating researcher needs, emerging technologies, and finally, we'll end with stories from the trenches, tales of woe and triumph. All right, now, the Becoming an Institutional CI Leader program. So in the past, we had 2 or 3 workshops now that had either for the whole workshop or really, I think, for part of the workshop. I don't think we've ever done a whole workshop on this before. For part of the workshop, we did sessions that were not about how to facilitate, but were at the leadership level, things that were not facilitation, but were sort of running the joint, running the organization, right? So now we've separated that out to have a new workshop, a standalone workshop. It's just a couple of days on how to transition from CI Pro to institutional CI Leader. So again, these are 1.25-hour sessions. There's a total of 7 sessions, but one of them is just a mini talk with an overview. Most of it is panels. It's on, again, just on Zoom, and it's for all CI professionals, not just for CI facilitators. The sessions, again, we did a poll and said, what do you think would be the things people would want to learn? And again, all of the presenters are volunteers. So I'm giving a little short talk at the beginning. We got a mini talk. We have 6 panels and 35 panelists. So Wednesday, we've got an intro to the program. Then we do the CI funding landscape. Obviously, that one's going to be exciting this year. Strategic thinking and visioning, recruiting and retaining computing and data intensive researchers. And then the next day, deciding which technologies to adopt and when, leading teams of CI professionals, and low-cost solutions for hardware. And I want to say all of the presenters, all of the speakers, the panelists, the moderators, all of them are themselves CI leaders, either current or past CI leaders. And so they'll be able to speak with a lot of experience about these issues. All right, so next level is the CI Leadership Academy. So what is that? Well, it began with an idea. Oh, yes, Christina,
I have just a super quick question related
please.
to, I think, the previous level is
Sure.
it seems like the focus is, and can you go back one slide just to make sure I'm not, yeah, okay. The focus is very CI specific.
Sure.
Um, is this is there a difference? How much specific stuff do you need to learn about CI to become an institutional CI leader versus like, generic, you could take any old leadership course. I think there's obviously stuff added, but I'd be curious about like what you identified as most important, why, and kind of how you see those two things working together as part of people's professional development.
Right. And okay, so to be honest, I could look at the session titles because to first order, that's what we have to work from. We have some abstracts as well, but they more or less expand on the session titles. And I could say these are the things that are pretty CI specific. So the CI funding landscape, which is going to look at specific funding programs, I'd say that's CI specific. Recruiting and retaining computing and data intensive researchers, I would say that CI specific, not in the sense of being specifically about CI, but rather in the sense that most, call it research focused capabilities at institutions of these kinds either don't have to go looking for those folks or the kinds of things and the way that they look for them doesn't align with the way we do it on the CI side. So it's that one's sort of in the middle, I would say, but still is pretty specific to CI. Deciding which technologies to adopt and when, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that's pretty CI. Leading teams of CI professionals, mid
Yeah.
at best. I would say that one is somewhat general. Strategic thinking and visioning, pretty general. Yes, we will talk about the CI specific aspects of that, but it's not gigantically about CI and only minorly about generic stuff. It's more tilted toward the generic side, less tilted toward the CI side. I think that's a perfectly fair way. And then low cost solutions for hardware, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that's going to be pretty CI specific.
Right. Yeah, so
Does
this is
that
really focused. There's some general pieces, but it's kind of focused on like what makes CI leadership different. And so it might be a nice complement to like, your run of the mill, here's how to manage people, here's how to do a SWOT analysis kind of course, but this fills in the
right?
missing pieces.
Yeah, I think that's exactly correct.
Okay.
And um, well, let me say it this way. If we could get the stuff we need from other sources, nothing would make me happier. And this is why, for example, the virtual residency doesn't have a section on how to do MPI programming, because there are lots of other places you can go and learn MPI programming. So we said, what is the set of things that a CI facilitator needs to know and can't get from somebody else who's already doing it better, right? And with more experience. And so that's how we picked that set of topics. And the same thing is true here. What's the set of things they would need and they can't go to, what is the one that starts with an M? More something, mortgage, more, I don't know, whatever it is. But, that one and say, okay, you teach me how to be a leader. And it's the same training that the same training that your faculty get when they want to become institutional administrators. Why can't you just do that? And the answer is, please do that. But this too, if you're going to be a CI leader.
Yeah, that's super helpful.
Okay, so now the CI Leadership Academy. And again, the original goal of the CI Leadership Academy was we want to train institutional leaders, CI leaders, to become national CI leaders. And what got me thinking about that was we were at the precursor workshop series to PERC, and there was a discussion. It came up in the discussion that, the gray heads are getting older and they're going to retire. And then where are we? We're all going to be screwed. And I went up to one of the people who was running the entire workshop, the entire conference, Jim Bottom, who at the time was at Clemson. And I said, Jim, why don't we just, get those folks together with the up and comers and have them teach how to do that? And he was like, yeah, why aren't you writing a proposal about that? So I wrote a little workshop proposal, and we ran a couple of workshops, and it got out of control, as these things will, in the best way possible. And so now we have a workshop series, and I'm calling it 5.5 workshops, because one of them was a half-day workshop at PERC, and I don't think we can really call that a full workshop. So we did some workshops, and so now, and it was at the PERC half-day workshop that people said, that the participants said, yes, we really value learning how to become national CI leaders, but we'd also like to learn how to be better institutional CI leaders. So can you add that into the program? And I realized that's going to be really hard to play mix and match in the same workshop. So how about we do that as a separate workshop of its own? And so now we sort of have 2 levels of the CI Leadership Academy program. And we've now done both levels. So the first time we did this, call it intermediate CI leadership, institutional CI leadership workshop, was a few months ago at the spring meeting of the Coalition for Academic Scientific Computation. And we've been collaborating with them on the last, call it 2.5 workshops. And that's been a huge success. We've gotten great feedback. There's been lots of people attending. It's been really terrific. And again, the reason we're doing this is because the gray heads are retiring, and we're going to lose their wisdom and experience from our workforce. It also means that those of us whose heads aren't completely gray yet, we are, each and every one of us, going to be dragged kicking and screaming upstairs. And if we're going to be dragged kicking and screaming upstairs, we'd better be able to hit the ground running when we get there. And so this is the best we can do to prepare ourselves, is to pick the brains of the people who already know how to do it. And the reason we need to do it is we're at several thousand retirements per day, headed to 10,000 retirements per day in the not too distant future. They are going out the door, and it's not obvious they're coming back. They're probably not coming back. And so we need to we need to do a data dump out of their heads before they run off. That was our motivation. And who's a better candidate to be a national CI leader than someone who's already a CI leader, just at the local scale? So we started with topics like experiences being a senior or national CI leader, a life in cyber infrastructure, leadership for team science and grand challenges. This was something that our second NSF workshop grant focused on. Securing institutional commitments. How do you get your institution to want, or at least begrudgingly be willing, to give you whatever the resources are that you need, which I will distill down to money? How can you get them on board with that? We also did a whole bunch of what we call perspective panels, where we would bring in people from various categories of professions or contexts and have them give us their perspective. So for funding agencies, industry, researchers, and institutional leaders. So this is like CIOs, VPRs, presidents, deans, provosts, that sort of thing. And these have been fantastically successful and valuable. With the funding agency and the industry folks, what we carefully did was we selected people who were no longer in those roles, because the people in those roles typically are very constrained from being candid. They're not really allowed to talk about what's going on or even what their experiences have been. Whereas people who are no longer in those roles typically have far fewer constraints, and they can give us more reality, which is, the more reality we can soak in, the better. Even if the reality is a little bit painful, it's still very useful to have at it. Okay, and then we did a bunch of breakout sessions. So, and I'm not going to go into all the details of this because there's a lot of them, but trying to find topics that would be useful, but that people wouldn't be completely filled with regret when they missed 2 out of the 3 during a time slot. And I think we did a pretty good job with that. And then they would report back with what they had come to in their discussions. Okay, so how does this all fit together? So again, it's the 5 levels. The virtual residency program, its role is to train the facilitators. So the introductory level, where it's foundational skills, the intermediate level, where it's skills to build upon the foundational skills, then the becoming an institutional CI leader, so skills to transition into leadership, and then the CI Leadership Academy at the institutional level, and then transitioning to the national level. Now, what I haven't talked about yet, but I've got a whole bunch of slides, which I won't be able to get through all of, so we'll just take a little taste of it, because I've gotten through half my slides in 3/4 of my time, as usual. But we'll get a taste of the Certified Cyber Infrastructure Facilitation Training and Development Program, which is the program to create certification. Okay, so what are our next steps? We're doing a new workshop in each of these areas every year. I don't know if we'll do a becoming an institutional CI leadership workshop every year. That's not decided yet, whether it be every year or every other year. We haven't come to a decision about that, but we will be doing them as a series. The rest of them, I think the pattern is we're just going to do it every year. Every year, the community will build the workshop together collaboratively. So it's not a top-down thing. But we want all of this to keep going and going. This is the Energizer Bunny of CI professional training. By the way, so are the CI professional training opportunities in other facings. This is the one in the 2 facings, researcher facing and stakeholder and strategy facing. Okay, so in my remaining 12 minutes, and I at any time, feel free to ask questions. Please don't be shy. I love questions. I don't have a goal to get through a certain number of slides. And even if I did, there's no hope that I would achieve that goal.
It's actually
So,
if we can
yes.
try to make this part a little bit shorter to make sure we have sort of unallocated time for questions people may be holding or coming up with at the end, I think that would be great.
Okay, I will zip through it very quickly. Just give a little background. We got a grant from the NSF to do this. And the idea is to create a professional development certification, which is very different from a matriculated credential. This is an unmatriculated informal education credential. We are a first of our kind non-matriculated certification of professional development for the recruiting and data professional community, at least the first that I'm aware of. So it's a badge system, and then certifications are built from collections of badges. Why aren't we doing degrees? I mentioned earlier, because there aren't enough of us to go around to build a degree program. There was actually an attempt, I think about 15 years ago, at a community college in Texas to create an associate's degree program in HPC system administration. And it flamed out, and then they switched to cloud, and that flamed out. And so now they have an AI, I don't know if it's AI administration, but they have an AI associate's program. But I suspect, and they didn't discuss it with me, but I suspect that what happened was when they said HPC system administration, nobody had ever heard of HPC. So why would they sign up to devote a career to that? Why would they pay thousands of dollars to learn how to do something they had no idea what it was, right? But even with cloud, they couldn't make a go of that. There wasn't enough demand locally within a reasonable driving distance of their institution to turn it into a degree program or even a certificate. What are our objectives? Well, from the perspective of the facilitators, provide both training and proof of mastery of the relevant skills and cultivate the community. From the perspective of CI centers, of providers of CI, increase the uptake of facilitation in order to increase the uptake of cyber infrastructure. And finally, from the perspective of the researchers, increase their productivity by glomming onto, by taking advantage, exploiting the expertise of these CI experts. So how do we do this? We figure out which skills are the most relevant, and we did some surveys to figure that out. We developed the training mechanism, which mostly came out of the virtual residency, an exam and a scoring rubric, and those exams mostly are developed now. Construct pathways for certification, test the badging methods, and then we're doing an evaluation. And I'm going to sort of skip over something. We asked about these topics, and they prioritized for us what they thought were the highest priorities topics. And we split it between what do experienced facilitators think versus what do CI organization leaders think. And they actually had a lot of consensus, especially at the high end. Some of the results were very surprising. Some of them were what you would expect. And so we did that survey. And I think given that I have less than 10 minutes left, I'll stop here. And those of you who want the rest of this story, we have a Buffett perk. And sign up for the virtual residency workshops. All right, ask me questions. I love questions. They're my favorite thing.
All right. So Henry, thank you very much for joining us today and presenting. And